So I think after we have seen some information about sprint testing and jump testing, we now move to how we can integrate information, how we can develop the training program. And I will be using an example in a sport I'm very familiar and passionate about, which is handball. But there is also another reason. Handball is a very successful sport here in Qatar. The Qatar national team was a silver medalist in the 2015 World Championships that were held here. We ran a big project here during the World Champs and has been confirming leadership in Asia since then, and has been performing very well at the last World Championships in Egypt under coach Valero Rivera. So there is a connection with Qatar and handball. What I would like to start with is, first of all, it's important when you are developing a training plan or a training planification for any sport, is to consider how you are going to use the information, the testing, the information about the sport, how you're going to put everything together to have a successful plan. So the first thing that is very important to consider is that you need to identify very early what it takes to succeed in a sport. So you need to know the results, the score, the demands, what's important, so you can start thinking about what you need to do for your athletes. You need to define the performance model, so you need to know the physiological demands, the technical demands, tactical aspects, nutritional aspects, anything that can tell you what is important in that particular sport. Then you need to start determining the KPIs, which is what do you need to measure in your athletes or in your team, and how that information can drive the program and how that information can be helpful for your program. Then you finally can assess the athlete. So we've seen some examples of assessments before in sprints and jumping, and you can identify the strengths and weaknesses of your athletes. Once you have that information, of course, you can start planning and deploying the program of intervention. And it's about a detailed training plan, the detailed intervention you're going to do. And finally, you have a phase of review by repeating those assessments and having continuous information on the progress of the athletes or the lack of it. If you want to know more about this, there is a specific book chapter in this new book that is about to come out in the next few weeks, which is the NSCA's Essentials of Sports Science. And there is a dedicated chapter I wrote on key performance indicators in sport, so you can read more about it. But let's go back to the example of handball. So if you use that framework in handball, what do we know about handball in terms of performance determinants? There is a series of things that determine performance, the physiological demands, the technical demands, the tactical demands, etc. But if we focus on the physiological demands, we know that there is a certain level of aerobic capacity that is needed, anaerobic capacity, sprinting ability, repeated sprint ability, jumping and throwing, acceleration and deceleration. And then we know that the training interventions, for example, to improve the aerobic capacity can be high-intensity, intermittent type of training sessions, small-sided games, or more general type of activities on the track. And one way we can assess the progress of the athlete or identify at what level the athlete is at is using a test like the 30-15 intermittent test developed by Martin Boucher. So this is a way that you can build a framework to help you drive the type of assessments you need to implement in your teams and in your athletes, and also the type of interventions that you can write in your program. And what do we know from handball performance demands? We have quite a lot of information now. So in the chapter that you downloaded, there is this work from Claude Karcher and Martin Boucher. So we know that different positions would cover different distances at different speeds during a handball game. And if you're not familiar with handball, we can probably cluster the positions in few main ones. So the wings are the ones that play in attack in this position. The backs are the ones that play in the middle. The center back is also considered a back in most of the analysis, is a playmaker of the team. And then the pivot or the line player plays on the line in attack. And the goalkeeper has got specific requirements because, of course, he's not running around much. But it's important for saving balls and trying to keep the score down for your team. So the data we have is that athletes can cover a distance up to 5,000 meters and more at very high level. And the way they run on the field is divided in different types of activities, from walking to running to fast sprinting and total sprinting. And we also know that they spend a relative amount of time at very high intensity, moderate to high intensity, depending on the position they play, on their level of fitness, on the characteristics of the match, and the technical and tactical disposition of the team. During the World Championships in 2015, we conducted a very large-scale study where we analyzed all the games of the World Championships using video technology, and we were able also to identify different patterns of activity within the athletes, not only the total distance, but also, for example, the number of acceleration and decelerations that they were performing in different directions on the field according to their position of play and the technical and tactical characteristics of the match. A number of papers have been published as a consequence of that, but what we found was that we can really identify the demands of the players depending not only on the nominal position they have on the field of play, but also on the specific demands they have within a team in terms of technical and tactical assignments that they are given to the coach. So in this graph here, you can see the difference, for example, between a player that is appearing now very often in high-level teams, which is a defense specialist, so somebody that only plays in defense, and you can see that the area of activity is concentrated in the defensive part, first half and second half. The attack specialist, so somebody that comes only in attack, so it's always switching with the defense specialist, and you can see that the zone of attack is, of course, the one that is covering the most, and the different intensity depends on the color you see on this graph. And a player that has attacking and defensive demands that is playing in both positions, you can see that the distance covered is a lot more, the intensity that he covers is a lot higher, and there is, of course, a larger physiological demand on this kind of player. So what we have published and suggested in this number of papers is that there is a big difference between the demands of different players. You shouldn't assume that they are the same just because they play a nominal position, but you should find out more what they actually do. And in this particular case, we were probably in the first paper that kind of highlighted the role of the defense specialist and specifying the kind of activities they do. And even if the total distance is not very high, the demands are really constrained to a lot of small accelerations in a very short period, in a very short space. So the training prescription for this kind of player, by knowing this data, can be, of course, different to the demands of other players. What else do we know? This is in your chapter. We know, for example, that the demands depend a lot not only on the position the players are in, but also on the tactical position they have to play in a team. If they defend 3-2-1, or if they defend 5-1, or if they defend 6-0, is a completely different thing. But what we know is that they might spend a large amount of time near the maximal heart rate, especially if they are playing a lot on court in defense and attack position, and their level of blood lactates can be very high, even reaching levels over 12 to 14 millimoles. This is, of course, depending on their individual activity on court, and there is a large variability depending on the position they play. In this case, the center back at 3.1 millimoles per liter of blood lactate measured, whether the left back at 12.6. So again, the key is to make the measurements that are relevant to identify what the demands of your players are, and then use that information to implement the appropriate training activities. Handball is really a track and field played in a team scenario, because we have three main activities that are performed. We have sprinting, jumping, and throwing. And we know, for example, from the literature that the sprints and accelerations are performed with distances that are ranging from 2 to 3 meters up to 18 meters. The length of the handball court is 40. There are more than 800 activity changes in one match, and there is about 120 seconds average recovery times in between. So it's an intermittent game. There's a lot of things happening, and so if you are developing a sprinting program, you need to know that this is what's happening. If you want to develop their jumping abilities, you should know that 70% of the shots are jump shots in handball. Ground reaction force at the moment of contact on the ground with these players is about 3 times their body mass, and even more, and usually they take off with about less than 300 milliseconds ground contact. So if you are designing a strength training program, this is key information that you need. Throwing speed is very high. In the last World Championships, you might have seen a few players reaching this speed, 120 kilometers per hour top throwing speed. Wings and pivot are also performing a variety of spin shots that require fast speed of rotation of the shoulder. And you should look at the position of the shoulder and the body position when they are performing those shots. And finally, goalkeepers, they have about a 30% save rate at the elite level. And we have shown that if you want to win at the elite level, you need high save rates, of course. And now, because of the new rules that have been implemented with the attacking goalkeeper position, they have to perform a lot more movement, because most of the times they have to sprint out of their goal to change with the attacking player and then sprint back in when the attacking player comes out. So I think their demands have changed a little bit, and so you should take that into account when designing the training program. So what do you do with this information? From knowledge, you have to move to planning. And so this is a useful framework that was in your chapter, where you have the position of the player, the strength demands of this kind of player, the speed demands of this kind of player, the metabolic function or the metabolic demands of this kind of player, and also from the injury studies we know what kind of injury prevention plans you can put in place. And so when you know this, you have a good framework to work on, you know how to assess your players, you are finally moving to a planning activity where you can start implementing a variety of training sessions. And these are examples of how you can program the training sessions details with particular reference to developing speed endurance or the endurance specific capacity of players in handball. So these are examples of typical sessions where you can have short intervals or repeated sprint training or sprint interval training or using small-sided games. This is the type of intensity you can reach. This is the between effort recovery you can have, the expected time near VO2 max, the oxygen energy delivery system that you target with these different activities, the expected blood lactate, and the expected neuromuscular load. And these are examples of some of the sessions where you have players performing technical activities or repeated sprints. And in this particular graph, you can see that if you plan your small-sided games appropriately, you can reach metabolic demands that are very similar to sprint intervals, but also by measuring very simple things like the time spent over 90%, for example, of heart rate max, or the time spent over 90% of your VO2, if you have the ability to measure it, you can cluster and classify the different drills and start to be better at planning sessions, putting the right drills into the right place. And again, if you have now the access to inertial measurement units that can give you information about the distance covered by the players and the number of accelerations and decelerations, you can start to cluster and characterize training sessions that are handball specific, also having clear information about not only the metabolic demands but also the work output that the athletes perform. Strength training is of course very important in handball. As we've seen before, there is a variety of demands. This is an example of a typical strength and conditioning program, a pre-season for an elite team of the Italian league quite a few years ago, and with a systematic approach where you individualize the training program for your athletes. In a very short period of time in pre-season, it's possible to improve the counter movement jump by 9%, for example. This is a first league team that went into European Cups in Italy. And also with a systematic training, it's possible to improve force and power abilities of the upper body. Like in this case, a player that started a systematic strength training program in 1999, a few years later, there's a big improvement in power output as measured in the bench press exercise with different loads. And we know very well that in handball there is a correlation between the power output you produce during a bench press and throwing speed. So it's quite an important KPI that you can implement in your handball teams. And we have seen that with systematic approaches, it's possible to shift the force velocity and the power velocity curve, force velocity to the right and the power velocity relationship up. So you improve power output and the ability to produce force. So the key is to have a plan and to have KPIs and assessments in place to identify what's happening in your athlete and modify your training program. So how can sports science make a difference? As we've seen before, collecting, analyzing, sharing training and competition data is your evidence that you try to gather. The day-to-day interaction and the development of the coach library allows you to support in situ and enhance the coaching activities. So if you measure things that are happening on the field of play, in the gym, or periodically in your athletes, you can interact with the coaching staff, you analyze what the coaches do, and you can provide useful information to modify drills or activities or introduce new activities to improve the players. There are special projects that you can do with data, like what we've seen before in the talk from Dr. Phil Graham-Smith. You can assess, for example, fatigue in your players after a game. So you can start answering questions using testing and information that can influence your decision making for various interventions on the players. And finally, debrief. If you continuously reassess the training and the competition support process, you have arguments to debrief and improve the process all the time. Otherwise, it's always about opinions, and opinions without data are not very powerful means of improving athletes' performance. So you can use a very simple framework of assess, plan, and review. So assess is what we've seen before. You can engage and collect evidence, collate and score. You can conduct integrating analysis. You can define your sports coaching model and understand it and define the measures you're going to use, set targets, identify and prioritize actions, and have clear outputs, which is a coaching action plan, and improve the coaching knowledge base. So you modify continuously what you're doing to make it better. And finally, you can improve athletes by defining the athlete profile, define the target profile as we've seen before, define the coaching and training activities, schedule the activities appropriately, and finally use the data for review. And this can only happen when you record the measures, you analyze the measures and provide feedback, and you have the final output of metrics to track coaching and performance. So use a framework, put it in place, use the right testing, use the right data, and you can definitely use the information to drive the training program. So in summary, I think if you use a scientific approach to define the performance model, as we've seen in the example of handball, you have the advantage of knowing what needs to happen for your players. You can develop a data-driven approach to gather intelligence, so you can test, assess, modify, and see how things are going. You can assess the athlete, the team, and track their progress, so you can individualize the training interventions and also make sure that the athletes are progressing in the right way. And you can assess the content of training sessions to identify how to modify drills. But the key is to develop reporting tools that are able to inform practice. And I'm very happy to say that the next speaker will be talking about this particular topic, so you will be able to see examples of how reporting tools are used from data gathering to inform practice. And thank you for your attention.